It was a crisp autumn morning at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport when Jennifer Chen rushed through the terminal, her designer-wheeled bag clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. As a successful social media consultant who'd built her reputation by being outspoken online, she was used to getting her way. Today's first-class ticket to New York was just another reminder of how far she'd come from her humble beginnings. The boarding process started normally enough. Jennifer breezed through priority boarding, nodding with satisfaction as she made her way down the jet bridge. Her sleek blazer and perfectly styled hair reflected in the plane's windows as she walked, making her feel every bit the influential professional she portrayed herself to be on Instagram. But the moment she stepped into the first-class cabin, something caught her eye that made her perfectly plucked eyebrows knit together in displeasure. 3 rows ahead, a man in his 50s sat quietly reading through a stack of papers. He was dressed casually, too casually for first class, she thought, in a simple blue button-down shirt and khakis. But it wasn't his casual attire that made Jennifer's blood pressure rise. It was the bright red MAGA hat perched on his head. Jennifer felt her fingers instinctively reach for her phone. She'd built her following by calling out what she considered problematic behavior, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity for new content. The man appeared completely absorbed in his work, occasionally making notes in the margins of what looked like financial documents. He hadn't noticed her staring, or if he had, he showed no sign of it. As she stored her designer bag in the overhead compartment, Jennifer couldn't help but listen to the conversations around her. The flight attendants were being unusually attentive to the man in the hat, addressing him with an extra touch of deference that seemed odd for even a first-class passenger. One of them, a friendly-looking woman named Lisa according to her name tag, kept checking if he needed anything, calling him sir with notable warmth. Jennifer settled into her plush leather seat, but she couldn't relax. The hat seemed to beacon at her from 3 rows ahead, like a red flag waving in her face. She pulled out her phone and began typing furiously, drafting potential social media posts in her notes app. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she considered her approach. Should she start with a direct confrontation, film it for her followers, or should she try to get the flight attendants involved first? The pre-flight announcements began, but Jennifer barely heard them. Her mind was racing with possibilities, imagining the viral moment she could create. She'd done this before, called out what she saw as inappropriate behavior in public spaces, and her followers ate it up every time. This could be her biggest moment yet. What Jennifer didn't realize, as she sat there planning her next move, was that fate had dealt her a very different hand than she expected. The quiet man in the MAGA hat wasn't just another passenger she could intimidate into submission. The documents he was reviewing weren't ordinary business papers, and the flight attendant's special attention wasn't just good customer service. She was about to learn a lesson about assumptions that would change her life forever. As the plane's engines began to roar to life and the cabin crew prepared for takeoff, Jennifer made her decision. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, smoothing her blazer with practiced confidence. The flight attendant, Lisa, was walking past, and Jennifer raised her hand to get her attention. In that moment, as she opened her mouth to speak, she had no idea she was about to become the subject of a story that would be shared millions of times across the internet. But not in the way she had planned. "Excuse me?" Jennifer said, touching Lisa's arm to get her attention. "I need to speak with you about a serious issue." Her voice carried just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, drawing several curious glances. Lisa turned with a professional smile, though her eyes showed a hint of concern at Jennifer's serious tone. "I don't feel comfortable with that man's political statement," Jennifer continued, pointing towards the MAGA hat. "It's creating a hostile environment in the cabin." She pulled out her phone, making sure its camera was pointed in the general direction of both Lisa and the man in the hat. "I'd like you to ask him to remove it or move him to a different section." Lisa's smile remained steady, but her posture straightened slightly. "Ma'am, While I understand your concerns, our airline policy protects passengers' right to wear political clothing as long as it isn't explicitly offensive or containing prohibited messages. Jennifer's cheeks flushed red. The calm, reasonable response wasn't what she'd expected or wanted. A few passengers had their phones out now, quietly recording the interaction. Perfect, Jennifer thought, not realizing she was about to become famous for all the wrong reasons. I don't think you understand, Jennifer pressed, raising her voice slightly. That hat represents hate speech. I have over 50,000 followers on social media, and they'd be very interested to know that your airline allows this kind of behavior in first class. She emphasized the last two words, as if the cabin's premium status somehow made her complaint more valid. The man in the hat hadn't moved or acknowledged the growing commotion. He simply turned another page in his stack of documents, his pen moving steadily across the paper. This seemingly casual dismissal of her presence only fueled Jennifer's indignation. I want to speak to your supervisor, Jennifer demanded, her voice now carrying throughout the entire first-class cabin. And I want everyone to know that I'm recording this for my own safety. She held her phone higher, making sure to capture everything. Lisa maintained her composure, though a knowing look flickered across her face. One moment, please, she said, stepping away briefly to confer with her colleague at the front of the cabin. They whispered together, occasionally glancing back at Jennifer. By now, the entire first-class cabin was watching the scene unfold. A businessman across the aisle had lowered his newspaper. A young couple had removed their earbuds. The quiet murmur of pre-flight conversation had died down to a tense silence. I'll be posting about this on every platform, Jennifer announced to no one in particular, her fingers already typing furiously on her phone. My followers need to know about this kind of enabling behavior. I can't believe in 2024 we're still allowing. She trailed off as Lisa returned, accompanied by the lead flight attendant. The new arrival, an elegant woman with graying hair, leaned in close to Jennifer and spoke in a low, clear voice that somehow made Jennifer's stomach drop. Ms. Chen, the lead attendant said, using Jennifer's name without being told it, I need to inform you that the passenger you're complaining about is Mr. Robert Thompson, the founder and CEO of this airline. She paused, letting the information sink in. Now, would you like to return to your seat, or shall we have a different conversation about appropriate behavior on our flights? The phone in Jennifer's hand suddenly felt very heavy. The cabin seemed to spin slightly as she processed this information. Around her, several passengers were poorly concealing their smiles, their own phones still recording. In that moment, Jennifer realized she had just made a terrible, terrible mistake, and the internet would never let her forget it. Jennifer's mouth went dry as the reality of her situation sank in. Her phone, which had felt like a weapon of justice just moments ago, now seemed to mock her as she noticed the growing number of passengers recording her embarrassment. Still, years of doubling down on social media had trained her to push forward, even when she probably shouldn't. Well, being the CEO doesn't excuse promoting harmful messages, she declared, her voice noticeably shakier than before. In fact, it makes it worse. I'll make sure all my followers know about this. The words came out automatically, but they sounded hollow even to her own ears. The lead flight attendant exchanged a glance with Lisa, both maintaining remarkable composure. Ms. Chen, this is your final opportunity to return to your seat and enjoy the flight quietly. Otherwise, we'll need to contact ground security. A young woman sitting nearby whispered to her partner, This is going viral for sure. The comment carried in the quiet cabin, causing several passengers to stifle laughs. Jennifer felt her face growing hotter by the second. That's when Mr. Thompson finally looked up from his papers. He hadn't raised his voice or shown any anger throughout the entire scene. Instead, he simply folded his hands on his tray table and turned to face Jennifer with an expression of calm interest. You know, he said in a surprisingly gentle voice, I've found that some of the best conversations I had started with people who completely disagreed with me. Would you like to have a real discussion about what's bothering you? Without phones or social media. His tone was genuine, lacking any hint of mockery or confrontation. Jennifer stood frozen, her carefully constructed world of online outrage crumbling around her. This wasn't how these confrontations were supposed to go. Where was the angry response? The defensive shouting? The content she could edit to make herself look like a hero? She stammered, looking around at all the phone cameras pointed at her. With horrible clarity, she realized she had become exactly what she often accused others of being, someone who judged and attacked without trying to understand. The flight attendants waited patiently as Jennifer's internal struggle played across her face. A few rows back, an elderly lady spoke up kindly. "Dear, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we might have acted too quickly." Jennifer's legs felt weak as the adrenaline that had been fueling her began to fade. Her carefully maintained image of a fearless social justice warrior was dissolving in real time, replaced by the uncomfortable reality that she had just tried to publicly shame the owner of the very airline she was flying on. And he had responded with more grace than she had shown. "Security has been notified and is on their way," Lisa informed her quietly. "You'll need to make a decision now about how you want this situation to end." The growing murmur of other passengers' conversations made it clear this scene was already spreading across social media, but not in the way Jennifer had planned. She could almost see the headlines forming. "Social media influencer tries to shame airline CEO, gets lesson in humility instead." Looking at Mr. Thompson again, she noticed something she had missed in her initial rush to judgment. His hat was worn and faded, clearly a personal item rather than a provocative statement piece. And while she had been creating a scene, he had been reviewing what appeared to be charity funding proposals for the airline's foundation. The reality of her situation hit her like a physical wave. She had become the very thing she claimed to fight against. Someone who judged others based on appearances and tried to publicly shame them without any attempt at understanding or dialogue. And now, as justice would have it, she was about to become an internet sensation for all the wrong reasons. Two airport security officers approached the first-class cabin, their reflective vests visible through the plane's windows before they even stepped aboard. Jennifer's stomach twisted into knots as she watched them make their way down the jet bridge. Everything suddenly felt very real. "I apologize," she blurted out, surprising herself with the words. I was completely out of line." Her voice cracked slightly, the carefully crafted social media persona falling away to reveal something more genuine and more vulnerable. Mr. Thompson raised his hand slightly, catching the flight attendant's attention before she could signal to the approaching security officers. "If Ms. Chen is willing to return to her seat and continue the flight calmly, I don't think we need to escalate this further," he said. His voice carried the weight of authority, but also showed unexpected kindness. The lead flight attendant nodded, but added firmly, "Any further disruptions will result in immediate removal, no exceptions." She gave Jennifer a meaningful look that made it clear this was her only chance. Jennifer sank into her seat, her designer blazer feeling too tight, too artificial, just like the online personality she had created. Her phone buzzed continuously with notifications, but for once, she didn't want to look at them. She could already imagine the clips spreading across social media platforms, her own medicine being served back to her in hefty doses. A few minutes passed in tense silence as the security officers spoke quietly with the flight attendants near the cockpit. Jennifer kept her eyes fixed on her lap, feeling the stares of other passengers. Her carefully applied makeup felt like a mask, and her expertly styled hair seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders. Then something unexpected happened. Mr. Thompson stood up, removed his hat, and walked over to her seat. The entire cabin watched in silence as he stopped beside her. "You know," he said quietly, "I bought this hat at a small family-owned shop in Ohio. The owner was a woman who'd lost her husband to cancer. Despite our different political views, we had a wonderful conversation about family, loss, and hope. She even showed me pictures of her grandchildren. He paused, turning the worn hat in his hands. That's why I wear it sometimes, to remind myself that behind every symbol, there's a human story worth hearing. Jennifer looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. There was no anger there, no desire for revenge or public shaming, just a quiet wisdom that made her carefully constructed worldview feel suddenly very small. The airline I'd built, he continued, was founded on the idea that everyone deserves respect, regardless of their beliefs. That includes you, Ms. Chen. Would you like to tell me your story? What brought you to this moment? The cabin remained silent, but the atmosphere had shifted. Phones were slowly being lowered as passengers witnessed something more meaningful than a viral moment. They were seeing a potential bridge being built across a divide that seemed impossibly wide just moments ago. Jennifer started, then stopped, fighting back unexpected tears. I think I've forgotten how to talk to people without a screen between us. The admission cost her something, but it felt like the first honest thing she'd said all day. Mr. Thompson smiled gently. Well, we have a 5-hour flight ahead of us. That's plenty of time to practice. He gestured to the empty seat next to her. May I? As the security officers left the plane, satisfied that the situation was under control, Jennifer nodded, finally letting go of her phone and turning to face him. The cabin crew began their final preparations for takeoff, and somewhere in the background, a passenger could be heard whispering, "Now this is the kind of content we actually need to see going viral." The plane was now cruising at 35,000 feet, and the first-class cabin had settled into a different kind of atmosphere than anyone had expected an hour ago. Jennifer sat with her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea that Lisa had brought her, while Mr. Thompson shared stories about his early days starting the airline. You know what our first plane was? He asked, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. A tiny 20-seater that made so much noise you had to practically shout to have a conversation. He chuckled at the memory. We've come a long way since then. Jennifer listened, finding herself genuinely interested despite her earlier prejudices. How did you handle the criticism? She asked quietly, thinking about her own social media presence. I mean, starting an airline. There must have been people who said you couldn't do it. Oh, plenty. He nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. But here's something I learned early on. The loudest voices aren't always the most important ones to listen to. Sometimes it's the quiet feedback, the uncomfortable truths that help us grow the most. A gentle chime sounded as the seatbelt sign turned off. Jennifer glanced at her phone, which she'd finally silenced after seeing the flood of notifications. Already, clips of her earlier behavior were spreading across every social media platform. #Linnekerin was trending, and her professional reputation was likely in shambles. I've built my whole career on calling out things I disagree with, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I never stopped to think about the real people behind the posts I made. She paused, looking down at her tea. I got so caught up in being right that I forgot about being kind. Mr. Thompson leaned back in his seat, considering her words. You know what's interesting about running an airline? He asked. Every day, we put people from all walks of life in a metal tube together, sending them miles above the earth. They might not agree on politics, religion, or anything else, but they all have to share that space and trust each other to make it work. A flight attendant passed by, discreetly refilling their drinks. Other passengers were still stealing glances at them, but now with curiosity rather than judgment. Some were even smiling, witnessing what seemed like an unlikely peace treaty being formed at 35,000 feet. I made a lot of mistakes when I first started this company, Mr. Thompson continued, but each mistake taught me something valuable. Maybe today's incident can teach us both something too. Jennifer nodded slowly, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. I just don't know how to fix this, she gestured vaguely at her phone. Everything I've built. Maybe it's not about fixing what you built before, he suggested gently. Maybe it's about building something new, something better. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out some of the papers he'd been reviewing earlier. These are proposals for our company's community outreach program. We're looking for ways to bring people together, to help them understand each other better. Would you like to take a look? Jennifer wiped her eyes, careful not to smudge her makeup, and found herself nodding. As Mr. Thompson began explaining the various community initiatives, she realized something profound. She'd walked onto this plane ready to fight, but instead found an opportunity to learn and grow. From somewhere behind them, a passenger was heard saying to their seatmate, "Well, this isn't the drama I expected from my flight today, but honestly, this is so much better." Several others nodded in agreement as the cabin settled into what felt like a shared moment of understanding. Back on the ground, reality hit harder than Jennifer expected. Her phone had practically melted down with notifications, and #Airline was now the #1 trending topic nationwide. Video clips of her confrontation were everywhere, being shared and commented on by millions. Opening her social media apps felt like walking into a hurricane. Her business email was flooded with messages from angry clients canceling their contracts. The social media consulting agency she'd built over 5 years was crumbling in real time. But what hurt most were the messages from people she'd previously called out online, now sharing their stories of how her public shaming had affected their lives. "I guess this is what they call karma," she mumbled to herself in her apartment that evening, scrolling through the seemingly endless comments. Some were cruel, others disappointed, and a few, just a few, showed genuine concern for her mental well-being. Her phone buzzed with a new notification. It was from a major news network requesting an interview about the incident. 3 other networks had already reached out, eager to capitalize on her viral moment of shame. She placed her phone face down on the coffee table, next to an untouched cup of tea that had long gone cold. Then something unexpected happened. A new hashtag started appearing. #ListenAndLearn. It had begun with a simple tweet from Mr. Thompson's official account. Today, at 35,000 feet, 2 people with different views had a real conversation. Maybe that's all we really need, the willingness to listen and learn from each other. #ListenAndLearn. The post included a photo taken by a flight attendant. Jennifer and Mr. Thompson sitting together, genuinely engaged in conversation, his MAGA hat sitting on the tray table between them. But it wasn't what people expected. Instead of fueling more division, the image sparked a different kind of conversation online. People began sharing their own stories of unexpected connections and changed minds. A conservative grandmother talked about her relationship with her liberal grandson. A former alt-right member shared how a kind conversation changed his perspective. The hashtag was becoming a space for genuine dialogue. Jennifer's doorbell rang, startling her from her thoughts. Opening the door, she found a delivery person with a package from Thompson Airline's corporate office. Inside was a handwritten note from Mr. Thompson. "Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best transformations. The community outreach position we discussed is yours if you want it. Your experience could help others bridge divides instead of creating them." Attached was a formal job offer. Director of Community Engagement and Digital Dialogue. The role would involve creating programs to help people from different backgrounds connect and understand each other better. It wasn't charity. It was an opportunity to use her social media expertise for something meaningful. Jennifer sat down at her desk and opened her laptop. For the first time in her career, she wasn't thinking about likes, shares, or going viral. Instead, she began typing what would become her most genuine post ever. "To everyone I've hurt with my previous actions, I'm sorry. Today, I learned the hardest and most important lesson of my life. It's easy to judge, to shame, to divide. What's hard, and what's worth doing, is listening, understanding, and finding common ground. This isn't the end of my story, but the beginning of a new chapter. Hashtag listen and learn. As she hit post, her hands were shaking, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. The first comment appeared almost instantly. It was from Lisa, the flight attendant. Now this is the kind of influencer we need more of. 1 week after the flight incident, Jennifer walked into Thomson Airlines headquarters for her first day in her new role. The security guard at the front desk gave her a knowing look. By now, everyone knew her face, but his smile was kind rather than judgmental. Her new office was modest but warm, with a window overlooking the airport runways. On her desk sat a small welcome package, including a company laptop and a framed photo of that memorable flight, now signed by the entire crew. Lisa had written a special note. Here's to new beginnings at 35,000 feet. Opening her email, Jennifer found hundreds of messages from airline employees sharing their own stories of difficult passenger interactions and how they learned to handle them with grace. One message particularly caught her eye. It was from a customer service representative who dealt with an angry passenger just yesterday. I remembered your story, the email read, and instead of getting defensive, I asked them to tell me more about why they were upset. We ended up having coffee in the airport cafe, and they left as a loyal customer. Your experience is already changing how we work. Mr. Thompson had kept his word about the company memo. Instead of painting Jennifer as a villain, he'd used the incident to launch a company-wide initiative called Skybridge, a program designed to train staff in de-escalation and cross-cultural communication. Jennifer would be leading the project, turning her viral moment into a teaching tool. During her lunch break, she sat in the employee cafeteria, nervously holding her tray. A group of flight attendants waved her over to their table. "We've been dying to meet you," one of them said warmly. That flight changed how we think about difficult situations. As Jennifer shared her lunch hour with her new colleagues, she found herself talking openly about her transformation. "I used to think being an influencer meant having the loudest voice," she admitted. "Now I realize it's about having the most open ears." The afternoon brought her first major task, reviewing applications for the company's new community dialogue program. People from all walks of life had applied to participate in conversations aimed at bridging political and social divides. Reading through their stories, Jennifer felt a sense of purpose she'd never known in her days of chasing likes and shares. A knock on her office door interrupted her work. It was Mr. Thompson, still wearing his casual clothes but without the hat that had started it all. "How's the new office?" he asked, glancing around with genuine interest. "It's perfect," Jennifer replied, then hesitated before adding, "though I have to admit, it feels strange being on this side of things now." He nodded understandingly. "You know what makes airlines work?" he asked, gesturing toward the window where planes were taking off and landing. "It's not just the technology or the schedules. It's trust. Millions of people trust us to bring them together safely, regardless of their backgrounds or beliefs. That's what we're really in the business of, building trust." Looking at the stack of applications on her desk, Jennifer felt a surge of determination. "I want to make something good come from what happened," she said firmly. "I want to help build that trust." Mr. Thompson smiled, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small pin, the company's new Skybridge logo. "You already are," he said, placing it on her desk. "Sometimes the best bridges are built by people who once stood on opposite sides." As he left, Jennifer picked up the pin, its silver surface catching the afternoon sun. On it was engraved a simple message that brought tears to her eyes. Every flight is a chance to understand. 3 months into her new role at Thomson Airlines, Jennifer stood nervously behind the podium at the company's annual leadership conference. The audience was filled with airline executives, staff members, and even some familiar faces from that fateful flight. Her presentation was titled, "From Conflict to Connection: A Journey at 35,000 Feet." "You know," she began, her voice slightly shaky, "6 months ago, I thought I knew everything about influence. I had the followers, the engagement rates, the viral posts. She paused, looking around the room. What I didn't have was understanding. The screen behind her showed screenshots of her old social media posts, each one an example of what she now recognized as digital bullying. I used to wake up every morning looking for things to be angry about, she admitted. It was exhausting, but I thought that's what making a difference looked like. In the front row, Lisa, now one of her closest friends at the airline, gave her an encouraging nod. Next to her sat Mr. Thompson, his presence a reminder of how much could change with one conversation. The Skybridge program we launched has now connected over 1,000 passengers who requested to sit next to someone with different views. Jennifer continued, clicking to the next slide. We've had conservatives and liberals sharing meals in our airport lounges, climate activists and oil company executives finding common ground, and even rival sports team fans becoming friends. The audience chuckled at the last example, especially when she showed a photo of two passengers wearing opposing team jerseys sharing a pizza during a delayed flight. Sometimes, she added with a smile, the best conversations start with being stuck together. She clicked to a new slide showing the program's results. Customer satisfaction scores had risen by 30%. Conflict incidents on flights had dropped dramatically. But most importantly, they had collected hundreds of stories of genuine connection and understanding. Last week, something amazing happened, Jennifer said, her voice growing stronger. A passenger recognized me from the viral video and asked for a selfie. But not for the reason you might think. She clicked to show the passenger's social media post. Met the former #Airline Karen today. She taught me it's never too late to change your story. The room grew quiet as Jennifer shared some of the letters they'd received. A businessman wrote about making peace with his estranged daughter after a Skybridge conversation reminded him of what really mattered. A college student described how a chat with a senior citizen changed her view on generational divides. But my favorite story, Jennifer said, reaching into her pocket, is this. She pulled out the worn MAGA hat that had started it all. Mr. Thompson had given it to her as a reminder, and now it sat in her office as a symbol of transformation. This hat doesn't represent what I thought it did anymore, she explained. Now it reminds me that behind every opinion, every belief, every angry post, there's a human being with a story worth hearing. The presentation ended with a video compilation of Skybridge participants sharing their experiences. As the lights came up, the applause was genuine and heartfelt. But it was the tears in some audience members' eyes that told Jennifer her message had truly landed. After the presentation, a young flight attendant approached her. I had my own Karen moment last month, she confessed. But I remembered your story and asked myself, what would happen if I listened instead of judged? Jennifer hugged her, recognizing her former self in the young woman's honesty. That's all it takes sometimes, she said softly. Just the courage to listen. Later that evening, as she packed up her presentation materials, Jennifer found a note from Mr. Thompson. You didn't just learn from your mistake. You helped us all learn from it too. That's true influence. 1 year after the infamous flight, Jennifer stood in front of a very different audience. A college classroom full of social media marketing students. The professor had invited her to share her story as part of a course on digital responsibility and ethical influencing. Before I begin, Jennifer said, looking around at the young faces, many of them already on their phones, I want you all to pull up your social media accounts. The students looked surprised but complied. Now scroll through your last 10 posts. Count how many were meant to bring people together, and how many were meant to point out what's wrong with others. The uncomfortable shifting in seats told her everything she needed to know. She smiled understandingly. Don't worry. A year ago, all of my posts were about calling people out. Now let me tell you how one flight changed everything. As she shared her story, she noticed something remarkable. Phones were gradually lowered, and real eye contact was made. When she showed them the viral video of her confrontation with Mr. Thompson, several students gasped, recognizing it from their social media studies. That video has been viewed over 50 million times, Jennifer explained. But here's what most people don't know. It led to something much bigger than a viral moment. She proceeded to share the success stories from the Skybridge program, which had now expanded to 3 other major airlines. One student raised her hand. But don't you miss having a big social media following? I mean, you were an influencer. Jennifer smiled. I still am an influencer, she replied. But now I influence people to listen instead of shout, to understand instead of judge. My follower count is smaller, but the impact is real. She pulled up recent statistics on the classroom screen. The Skybridge program had facilitated over 10,000 meaningful conversations between people with opposing views. Airport lounges had been transformed into connection zones, where passengers could opt to meet someone different from them. Last month, Jennifer continued, we had a Christmas miracle of sorts. 2 families who were stuck at the airport during a snowstorm ended up sharing a holiday meal in our connection zone. They discovered they lived on opposite sides of the same political and social debates, but by the end of the night, they were exchanging recipes and contact information. The classroom was silent, absorbing her words. Jennifer pulled out her phone and opened her latest social media post. A simple photo of the airline's check-in counter with a sign reading, "Welcome aboard. Leave judgment at the gate." The most powerful thing I've learned, she said, her voice soft but firm, is that true influence isn't about proving you're right. It's about being brave enough to admit when you're wrong and wise enough to learn from it. As the class ended, students crowded around her, sharing their own stories of online conflicts and asking advice about responsible social media use. One quiet student waited until the others had left. I was actually at the airport that day, she admitted. I recorded the video and posted it to embarrass you. I've felt guilty about it ever since. She paused, looking down. Would you be willing to forgive me? Jennifer hugged the young woman. That video was the wake-up call I needed, she said warmly. Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best changes. Walking out of the classroom, Jennifer checked her phone. There was a message from Mr. Thompson, speaking at Harvard Business School next week. Want to co-present our case study on how one flight changed an entire industry's approach to human connection? Jennifer smiled, thinking about how far she'd come from that angry, self-righteous person who had boarded a flight ready for battle. She typed back a simple response. Count me in. But this time, you're wearing the hat.